The photograph sits in a state archive in Albany. Third floor, reference section, inside a paper sleeve, inside a labeled box. It shows a building 4 stories tall, central cupola, 2 wings extended outward like a posture of welcome, elm trees, a gravel path, stone steps leading to a pair of oak doors, and beside those doors, a brass plate fixed at eye level. The plate is too small to read. The caption tucked behind the photograph gives a name, a state, and a year of construction. It does not record a year of demolition. That record, if it ever existed, is gone. The photograph was taken sometime in the 1880s. You can tell by the grain, the flatness of the sky, the way the shadows pool hard at the base of the columns. The building in the frame is enormous, a central tower rising 4 stories above a symmetrical wing that extends in both directions farther than the camera can hold. The grounds are manicured. There are trees, there is a carriageway. Across the front of the main entrance, set into stone above the door, a lintel inscription has been partially worn but is still legible if you look long enough. The brass plate beside the entrance bears a name and a year. The name is a man's. The year is 1873. The building does not exist anymore. Most people have never heard of what it was. I was not looking for this. The original research had nothing to do with hospitals or architecture or the institutional history of the 19th century. I had been working through state land records. Agricultural assessments primarily cross-referenced against federal budget allocations for public infrastructure in the post-Civil War decades. It was the kind of research that produces long columns of figures and very few surprises. Counties, acreage, assessed values, appropriations. Page after page of the same categories repeating in different combinations. The hospitals appeared the way anomalies usually do in archival work. Not announced, not labeled as significant, just present in a column where something else was expected. The line items were too large. That was the first thing. The dollar figures allocated to what the ledgers called state lunatic asylums and state hospitals for the insane were, in several entries, larger than the figures allocated to the land-grant colleges being established in the same period under the Morrill Act. I noted it and kept going. Then I found it in a second state's records, then a third. By the time I was into the 4th set of documents, I had stopped moving through the columns and started looking for the hospital entries specifically. What I found when I started looking directly was not a footnote in American history, it was a system. Thomas Story Kirkbride was born in 1809 in Morrisville, Pennsylvania. He trained as a physician at the University of Pennsylvania, and in 1840 began his tenure as superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, a position he would hold for 43 years. By the time he published his treatise on the construction and organization of hospitals for the insane, in 1854, he had already been arguing for years inside the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane that the building itself was not incidental to treatment. The building was the treatment. The Kirkbride Plan, as it came to be called, and as it was formally codified in that 1854 publication, specified everything. The orientation of the structure relative to the sun, the width of the corridors and the height of the ceilings, the size of individual windows, which were to be generous. Kirkbride used the word generous because light was not decorative but curative. The linear arrangement of the wards stepping back from the central administrative block in a shallow V was deliberate. Patients with the greatest need for calm were housed at the ends of the wings, farthest from the activity of the center, while those recovering were placed closer in, easing their reintegration gradually and architecturally. The grounds were to include farmland, which patients would work not as a cost reduction measure, but because physical engagement with productive land was, in Kirkbride's framing, restorative to a disordered mind. This was not a fringe idea. The published proceedings of the Association of Medical Superintendents, which held annual meetings from 1844 onward, and whose records are still held in institutional and university archives, document a sustained professional consensus around these principles across 3 decades. Kirkbride's plan was adopted, adapted, and replicated. States commissioned architects. Architects designed to the standard. The buildings went up. The scale of what followed is not well represented in standard American history curricula. The federal census of 1880, the figures are available through the National Archives, counted more state-funded psychiatric institutions in the United States than it counted degree-granting colleges and universities. not approximately equal. More. The appropriations required to construct these facilities were, in several states, the largest single-line items in the public infrastructure budgets of their decades. The campuses were not modest. The average Kirkbride Plan institution sat on between 100 and 500 acres. The buildings themselves, in states like New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois, were among the largest structures of any kind erected in those states before 1900. The photograph on the table in front of me, the one I mentioned with the carriageway and the columns and the worn inscription, came out of a box of materials held at a county historical society in a state I will not name yet. Not because it is secret, but because it matters to establish the scale first, to understand that this was not one building. It was not one county's anomaly or one superintendent's ambition outrunning his appropriation. It was a national program, federally documented, professionally organized, architecturally coherent, and physically enormous. Which is why the question I found myself returning to, the more time I spent in these records, had a quality I can only describe as structural. Not emotional, not conspiratorial. Structural in the way that a load-bearing wall that has been removed from a building creates a structural question. The question was this: if the Kirkbride system was this large, this well-documented, this architecturally present, if it commanded this much acreage and this much appropriation and this much professional attention across this many decades, then what is the correct explanation for the fact that it occupies at most 2 paragraphs in the standard American history taught in most secondary schools? I want to be precise about what I mean by absent. I do not mean unfamiliar, the way an obscure battle or a minor legislative dispute might be unfamiliar. I mean that the physical footprint of the system, the hundreds of buildings, the thousands of acres, the tens of thousands of patients who lived within it for years and decades of their lives, has effectively no presence in the civic and heritage frameworks of the counties and states where it existed. The towns that grew up around these institutions do not, in most cases, feature them in their founding histories. The states that built them do not, in most cases, include them in their official architectural heritage registers at the level their scale would warrant. The patients who lived inside them, who worked the farms and walked the corridors and had their names written in admission ledgers that still exist in state archives, have no collective memorial, no acknowledged history, no named place in the record of what America built in the second half of the 19th century. A person born in 1855 who lived to the age of 85 would have died in 1940. She would have been 25 years old in 1880. The year the federal census counted more psychiatric institutions than universities. She could have been a patient. She could have been a nurse, an attendant, a superintendent's wife, a farmer hired to work the institutional land. She would have had memories of these buildings as living places, inhabited and functioning and physically present in the landscape. Her children, born perhaps between 1880 and 1900, would have been between 40 and 60 years old in 1945. Old enough to remember what their mother had told them, old enough to pass it forward. That chain of transmission was not broken by time alone. If this system was this large, and the federal records confirm that it was, then its near total absence from collective memory requires an explanation that scale and time alone cannot provide. The documents I found in those county boxes were not the last of what exists. They were only the first indication of how much more had been assembled, and how much of it had not survived to be assembled at all. Consider the arithmetic. A person born in 1855 who lived to the age of 85 would have died in 1940. She would have been 25 years old in 1880, the year the federal census enumerated more state-funded psychiatric institutions in the United States than it counted degree-granting colleges and universities. She would have been 44 years old when the last of the great Kirkbride construction campaigns concluded around the turn of the century. If she had worked as an attendant in one of these institutions, or had been admitted as a patient, or had grown up in a household where a family member was confined within those walls, she would have carried that knowledge for decades. Her children, born perhaps between 1885 and 1905, would have been between 35 and 55 years old when she died. Old enough to remember what she told them, old enough to pass it to their own children. Those grandchildren are, in a number of cases, still alive. This matters because what the buildings themselves could once communicate: scale, permanence, The physical argument that these institutions existed and that they were built to last is no longer communicable. The buildings are gone. What remains is the chain of living memory, and that chain is very nearly at its end. What was transmitted along it, and what was not, and why? These are the questions that the documentary record raises and cannot by itself answer. What the documentary record can answer is the question of scale. The published proceedings of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, which convened annually from 1844 onward and whose proceedings were printed and distributed to member institutions across the country, established the following without ambiguity. By 1870, more than 60 state-funded psychiatric institutions had been constructed in the United States. By 1880, that figure had grown. The federal census of 1880, cross-referenced against the land and infrastructure appropriations recorded in individual state legislative journals, shows that the average Kirkbride Plan campus occupied between 150 and 400 acres of developed land. The buildings themselves, the central administrative towers, the residential wings extending in the characteristic V or bat wing configuration, the service structures, the farm outbuildings, represented construction expenditures that, in several states, exceeded the combined construction costs of all public university buildings erected in the same decade. This was not a marginal program. It was not an experimental appendix to the main project of American civic life. It was, by any reasonable measure of physical footprint and public expenditure, among the most ambitious public construction programs of the 19th century, larger than most people understand, more systematically organized than most people have been told. The mismatch between this scale and the space the subject occupies in standard American historical education is difficult to account for on ordinary grounds. A student moving through a comprehensive American history curriculum will encounter, at some point, a reference to the asylum reform movement of the mid-19th century, most likely in connection with Dorothea Dix, whose advocacy helped precipitate state funding for these institutions beginning in the 1840s. That reference will occupy, at most, a paragraph. It will not include the acreage. It will not include the construction budgets. It will not include the names of the superintendents, the architectural specifications, or any accounting of how many people lived within these walls across how many decades. It will name the movement and move on. The movement did not move on. The movement produced buildings. The buildings produced records. The records describe a world that the paragraph does not. The association's proceedings confirm something else. The superintendents who ran these institutions were not marginal figures in 19th century American intellectual life. They corresponded with legislators, published in medical journals, testified before state commissions, and argued, sometimes successfully, for increased appropriations. Their annual reports, submitted to state governments and in many cases printed at state expense, are detailed documents. They enumerate patient populations by age, sex, county of origin, and diagnosis category. They describe the physical condition of the buildings, the acreage under cultivation, the quantities of food produced and consumed. They record the names of staff, the salaries paid, the improvements undertaken during the year. They are, in aggregate, among the richest documentary records of 19th century American institutional life that survive. They survive in state archives. They are accessible. They have simply not been read, not widely, not in proportion to what they contain. This is the mismatch at the center of the record. Not that the history is secret. It is not secret. It is in the archives. Anyone can request it. But that the history is absent from the frameworks through which most Americans encounter the past. It is absent from textbooks. It is absent from heritage registers. It is absent from the county tourism materials of the towns where these campuses stood. It is absent, in most cases, from the consciousness of the people who live on or near the land where the buildings once stood and where other structures now stand in their place. The buildings themselves were among the largest structures erected in their respective counties in the 19th century. Several were visible for miles. Several had patient populations that, at peak, exceeded the populations of the surrounding towns. The farms attached to these institutions produced food that was sold in local markets. The staff who worked there, attendants, nurses, farm laborers, laundry workers, kitchen staff, lived in the surrounding communities and spent their wages there. These were not remote or invisible institutions. They were embedded in the economic and physical landscape of their regions in ways that should have made them impossible to forget. And yet, the first anomaly in the documentary record is not the most subtle. Between 1950 and 1975, more than 400 structures associated with the Kirkbride system and its immediate architectural descendants were demolished across the United States. The figure comes from architectural surveys conducted in the 1990s, cross-referenced against state demolition permits and county property records. 400 is a conservative estimate. Some surveys place the number higher depending on how ancillary structures, chapels, farm buildings, staff housing are classified. 400 buildings in 25 years, an average of 16 per year, more than one per month, sustained across a quarter of a century. The pace was not uniform. The demolition rate accelerated sharply after 1963, a date that will become significant, and peaked between 1968 and 1972, when the rate of documented demolitions was roughly double what it had been in the preceding decade. But the demolitions did not begin in 1963. They began earlier. In some states, the first major Kirkbride plan structures were taken down in the early 1950s, before any of the policy frameworks that are now cited as their cause had been enacted, debated, or in several cases even proposed. This timing matters. It will matter more as the other pieces come in. For now, it is enough to note the number: 400 structures in 25 years, the majority of them buildings that had stood for between 50 and 90 years at the time of their demolition, buildings that had been constructed at enormous public expense and occupied continuously for most of their existence. They were not falling down. Several had recently undergone renovation. Several had been cited in state inspection reports as structurally sound in the years immediately before their demolition was authorized. They were taken down while they were still standing, to manage independently, under a shared institutional umbrella. When the institutional complexes were demolished, the placement records went with the buildings. The surviving documentation varies significantly by state and by organization. Some records were transferred to state archives before demolition, others were not. The Children's Aid Society's own archive, held in New York, contains substantial material for the New York placements, but is acknowledged by archivists to be incomplete for placements made after approximately 1910. For several Midwestern states, the placement records that would document the origins, identities, and destinations of children processed through the system in the final decades of the program simply do not exist in any archive. They are not missing in the sense of being lost in transit. They are absent in the sense that the buildings where they were kept are gone, and no transfer to a permanent repository was recorded before the buildings were taken down. 250,000 children, placed across a continent, many of them without recoverable records. Dr. John Kirwan was born in 1820 in Topsham, Vermont. He trained as a physician, and in 1854, the year of Kirkbride's publication, the year the orphan trains began, was appointed superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, located on a campus in West Philadelphia that Kirkbride himself had designed. Kirwan held that position for the better part of 2 decades. He was, during his tenure, among the most prolific publishers in his profession. His annual reports, submitted to the Pennsylvania State Legislature and printed at state expense, ran to dozens of pages each year, documenting patient populations, treatment protocols, physical improvements to the campus, and his own theoretical arguments for the moral architecture model. He died in 1890. His published reports are held at the Pennsylvania State Archives. They are available to researchers. They have not, to any degree commensurate with their detail and scope, entered the standard historical literature on 19th century American institutional life. What those reports describe across the years of Kirwan's tenure is a campus of considerable scale and deliberate design. The main building, constructed according to Kirkbride's specifications, featured a central administrative block with residential wings extending outward in the characteristic stepped configuration. The grounds included gardens, walkways, and a farm that Kirwan documented in his reports as both economically productive and therapeutically central to the institution's mission. His patient counts, recorded year by year, show a population that grew steadily through his tenure, reflecting the broader expansion of the system across the state and nation. That campus no longer exists in any form that the reports describe. The land it occupied is now developed for other purposes. The County Heritage Register for the relevant area does not include the hospital in its listings of significant 19th century structures, because there are no structures left to list. The patients Kirwan named in his reports, recorded by name, age, county of origin, years of residency, have no memorial, no marker, no acknowledged presence in the history of the place where they lived, in some cases, for the remainder of their lives. Kirwan's reports survive because they were printed documents distributed to the legislature. And printed documents, once distributed, are harder to collect and remove than manuscript records stored in a single location. They survive by the logic of dispersal. The manuscript materials, internal correspondence, patient case files, the administrative records that would document individual lives in granular detail, did not have that protection. They were in the building. The building is gone. What Kirwan's printed reports make visible, and what the absence of the manuscript records makes impossible to fully reconstruct, is the texture of daily life inside a system that housed, at its peak, hundreds of thousands of people across the country. People who were, in the language of the period, committed, confined, institutionalized, and who are, in the language of the present, almost entirely absent from collective memory. The printed record is a partial substitute. It is not a replacement. The fourth anomaly does not arrive slowly. It arrives in the legislative record, which is among the driest categories of historical document. Statutes, committee reports, floor vote tallies, enrolled bills with the signatures of governors who have been dead for a century. These are not dramatic materials. They do not announce themselves as significant. They require the kind of sustained cross-referencing that most researchers do not undertake because they are looking for something else, or because the question that would make the cross-referencing necessary has not yet been asked. The question, once it is asked, produces a result that the individual state records do not prepare you for. Between 1905 and 1915, 7 state legislatures passed statutes formally authorizing the transfer, sale, or conversion of land held by state psychiatric institutions to other public or private uses. The 7 states were not adjacent to one another. They were not operating under shared political leadership, were not responding to a common piece of federal legislation, were not reacting to a single triggering event that had crossed state lines and prompted parallel responses. Wisconsin acted in 1907, Indiana acted in 1908, Oregon acted in 1909, Virginia acted in 1910, Kansas acted in 1911, Ohio acted in 1912, New Jersey acted within that same compressed window, 7 states, non-adjacent, no common federal mandate. The votes occurred within a span of roughly 8 years. The standard explanation for legislative convergence of this kind is diffusion. The spread of a policy idea through professional networks, published journals, and interstate correspondence among administrators who attended the same conferences and read the same publications. It is a legitimate explanation. State-level policy in the 19th and early 20th centuries did diffuse in exactly this way, and the Association of Medical Superintendents and its successor organizations did provide precisely the kind of professional network through which administrative ideas traveled between states. Reasonable, except for the direction. Diffusion through professional networks tends to spread ideas that the professionals in those networks favor. The superintendents who ran these institutions had, for 60 years, argued in print, in testimony, and in their published annual reports that the land, the buildings, and the therapeutic environment they created were inseparable from the mission of the institution. Kirkbride's own treatise, which remained the foundational document of the profession well into the 20th century, was explicit on this point. The farm was not incidental, the grounds were not decorative, and the scale of the physical campus was not extravagance. It was treatment. The professional consensus, documented in the proceedings of every major conference the association held from 1844 onward, supported expansion, not contraction, not land transfer, not conversion to other uses. The legislative push to authorize that transfer did not originate with the superintendents. Where it originated, whose correspondence initiated the proposal, which legislative committee first drafted the enabling language, who lobbied for its passage in the first of the 7 states, is, in most cases, not documented in the surviving record. The committee files are incomplete. The correspondence files of the relevant executive offices are, in several states, missing for the relevant years. What remains is the enrolled statute, the floor vote tally, and the governor's signature. The record shows the outcome. It does not show the conversation that produced it. Now consider the sequence. The federal census of 1890, which contained the most granular patient-level psychiatric data ever assembled, was destroyed in a fire in January of 1921. The Census Bureau's planned statistical publication based on that data was abandoned in 1922. The land transfer statutes authorizing the conversion of institutional property to other uses were passed between 1905 and 1915. The major demolition wave of Kirkbride plan structures began in earnest in the early 1950s and accelerated sharply after 1963, when the Community Mental Health Act provided the legislative rationale for closing large state institutions. Deinstitutionalization, the policy framework most commonly cited as the cause of these closures, was formally articulated and enacted in the 1960s. Read that sequence again in the order it occurred. Records assembled, land transfer authorized before any closure policy existed, records destroyed, buildings demolished, policy articulated after most of the demolitions had already begun, and named retroactively as their cause. This is not the sequence that natural institutional decline produces. When an institution declines organically, when patient populations fall, when funding erodes, when a building genuinely becomes too costly to maintain, the policy framework articulating the decline tends to precede or accompany the physical dismantlement. You pass the law, then you close the building. You develop the alternative care model, then you discharge the patients. You establish the successor program, then you demolish the predecessor infrastructure. That is not what the record shows here. What the record shows is a different order entirely. The land was designated for transfer before the closure policy existed. The records documenting who lived in these institutions were lost before the buildings came down. The buildings came down before the policy explaining why they came down had been written. And then the policy was written, and it was applied retrospectively as a complete and sufficient explanation for a process of physical and documentary removal that had been underway for decades before the policy's enactment. The policy is real. Deinstitutionalization did occur. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963 did redirect funding from large state institutions toward community-based care. These are documented facts. The Act's effects were real, and in many cases, for many patients, the transition to community-based care was a genuine improvement in the quality of their lives and their freedom. But the Act does not explain demolitions that began a decade before its passage. It does not explain land transfers authorized a half-century before its passage. It does not explain why the census records that would allow us to reconstruct who was institutionalized during the peak decades of the system were destroyed in a building fire 40 years before the policy existed. A policy enacted in 1963 cannot be the cause of events that occurred in 1907 or 1921 or 1952. The sequence runs backward. And a sequence that runs backward is not a sequence of causes and effects. It is a sequence of results, arranged after the fact into the appearance of causes and effects. Records destroyed, buildings removed, then the explanation supplied. Fire, administrative reclassification, legislative transfer, accelerated demolition, and finally, last of all, latest of all, the official policy framework that is now cited as having driven the entire process. Each step individually defensible. Each step in isolation explicable by ordinary institutional logic. But the order in which they occurred, and the institutional category to which they applied consistently across multiple states, across multiple decades, producing the same result each time, is not what ordinary institutional logic produces. What does a history look like when the buildings that housed it are gone, the records that documented it were lost in a fire, the land was transferred before any closure policy authorized the transfer, and the explanation for all of it was written after most of the evidence had already been removed? It looks like a paragraph in a textbook. It looks like a footnote about asylum reform, attached to the name of one woman, Dorothea Dix, whose advocacy made the system possible, and whose name now stands as the complete summary of a system that was, by any measure, among the largest public infrastructure programs of the 19th century. It looks like nothing because the buildings are gone. Who benefits from a history that has no buildings left in it? The Traverse City State Hospital in Michigan opened in 1885. Its architect was Gordon W. Lloyd, a Detroit-based designer who had built churches and civic buildings across the Midwest, and who applied to the hospital commission the same formal vocabulary he used for those structures. Dressed stone, symmetrical facades, towers that rose above the roofline, not because the program required them, but because the program, as Kirkbride had defined it, understood that height communicated something to the people living beneath it. Something about permanence, something about the seriousness with which the institution regarded its own purpose. The campus Lloyd designed covered approximately 300 acres. The main building followed the Kirkbride linear plan with close fidelity. A central administrative block 5 stories tall, flanked by residential wings that step back in the characteristic V configuration, each wing subdivided into wards arranged by the severity of the patient's condition. The most acute patients occupied the wards farthest from the center. The patients closest to discharge occupied the wards nearest the administrative core, where the superintendent's office was located and where the daily business of the institution was conducted. The proximity was deliberate. Recovery in the Kirkbride model was measured partly by the patient's ability to re-enter the ordinary social world, and the architecture staged that re-entry by moving patients, ward by ward, closer to the point where the institution interfaced with the outside. The windows throughout the building were large. This was not aesthetic preference. Kirkbride's treatise specified window dimensions in terms of therapeutic necessity. Light was understood as an active agent in the treatment of disordered minds, not a passive amenity. The wards at Traverse City received morning light on one side and afternoon light on the other. The orientation of the building had been chosen to maximize this. The farm attached to the campus, which at peak production supplied grain, vegetables, and dairy products to the institution and to surrounding markets in Grand Traverse County, was worked by patients under the supervision of farm staff, and the work was documented in the institution's annual reports not as labor extraction but as prescribed activity, with the same clinical justification that a physician might apply to any other treatment protocol. This is what the Kirkbride buildings were actually doing, not warehousing, not punishing. Encoding in stone and orientation and window glass and cultivated land a theory that the human mind, when disordered, could be restored by an environment designed with sufficient intention. That the people inside these buildings were worth the light, worth the acreage, worth the stone. The Traverse City campus operated continuously from 1885 until its final wards closed in 1989, more than a century. At its peak in the 1950s, its patient population exceeded 3,000. The farm produced food for the region. The grounds were maintained. The buildings were in use. The main building was vacated in stages beginning in the 1970s. By the late 1980s, it was empty. Demolition proposals were advanced and, in the case of several ancillary structures, carried out. The central building survived, narrowly and because of private redevelopment efforts that converted portions of it to commercial use in the early 2000s. It is, as of this writing, one of the very few Kirkbride-planned structures of its original scale still standing in the United States. The farm is gone. The therapeutic landscape is gone. The patient population that gave the building its purpose is gone, dispersed across a care system that does not, in most cases, know or acknowledge that it replaced something. What was built in the place of the Traverse City farm and the demolished ancillary structures is instructive. Portions of the former grounds were rezoned for light commercial use in the 1990s. Portions became parking, portions were subdivided for residential development. The physical language of the replacement, asphalt, subdivision lots, commercial strip infrastructure, encodes a theory as surely as the original buildings did. It encodes the theory that the land requires no memory of what it held, that the people who lived there for years and decades left nothing worth marking. That continuity between what was and what is carries no obligation. This substitution of theories, recovery encoded in stone replaced by amnesia encoded in asphalt, was not unique to Michigan. In Oregon, the Oregon State Hospital in Salem, which had operated since 1883, saw its historic structures demolished in 2009 when a new facility was built on the adjacent grounds. The state retained a small portion of the original building as a museum. The rest was taken down. The land the demolished portions occupied was absorbed into the new campus's operational footprint. The patients who had lived in the original building across more than a century have a marker, a modest one. But the building itself, the physical argument the building was making, is absent. In New Jersey, the Trenton State Hospital, one of the oldest institutions in the country, operating since 1848, underwent demolition of its historic core structures beginning in the 1990s. The land has been partially redeveloped. A state agency occupies a portion of what was once patient grounds. The name has been changed. The buildings are largely gone. In Illinois, the Elgin State Hospital, established in 1872, saw the demolition of its primary Kirkbride-era structures beginning in the 1980s. The land was transferred. The state university system received portions of the property. The university's endowment, built in part on land that had housed patients for over a century, does not reflect that origin in any commemorative or institutional framework the university maintains. Land transferred from closed hospital properties in Oregon in the early 2000s. Land transferred to state university systems in Illinois beginning in the 1980s. Land rezoned for commercial and residential use in Michigan across the 1990s and 2000s. The pattern of transfer in each case moved the land from a use associated with dependent and institutionalized persons toward uses associated with education, commerce, and residential ownership. Uses that generate endowments, tax bases, property values. Uses that are remembered, uses that are named. The patients who lived on that land are not named. They have no endowment. They have no property value. They have the admission ledgers, which are in the archives, and the annual reports, which are in the archives, and the partial census reconstruction, which is in the archives and the buildings, some of them, a few of them, which are still standing. Fire, demolition, legislative transfer, administrative reclassification. Each mechanism applied in a different state, in a different decade, for reasons that were, in each individual case, documented and procedurally defensible. Maintenance costs, program modernization, deinstitutionalization policy, redevelopment opportunity, each explanation local, each explanation reasonable, not coincidence, pattern. When a building is removed from the landscape, what is removed is not only stone and glass and the particular arrangement of corridors and windows. What is removed is the argument the building was making. The Kirkbride buildings were making an argument every day they stood, that the people inside them were worth this much permanence, this much light, this much land, this much deliberate design. That argument required the buildings to make it. The buildings are gone. The largest public mental health infrastructure in American history was designed, constructed, populated, documented, and then, across a period of roughly 75 years, through mechanisms that were individually ordinary and collectively without precedent in any comparable institutional category, removed from the physical landscape and from collective memory within a single century. The removal was not the result of one decision made in one place by one authority. It was the result of many decisions made in many places by many authorities, each of which produced the same outcome. That outcome is the history we have now. A paragraph, a footnote, a name. Her name was Margaret Ellison. She was born in 1891 in a small city in upstate New York, the second of 4 children, the daughter of a man who worked in a furniture factory, and a woman who kept the household accounts with the precision of someone who understood that the margin between stability and its absence was not wide. Margaret was 40 years old when she was admitted to a state psychiatric institution in New York in 1931. She was 63 years old when she was discharged in 1954. She lived inside that institution for 23 years. Her admission record exists. Her discharge record exists. Both are held at the New York State Archives, filed under the institution's name in a series of ledgers that run from the 1880s through 1960. The handwriting in the admission ledger is small and regular, the kind produced by a clerk who filled these forms every week for years. Margaret's name appears on a line between 2 other names. Her age is recorded. Her county of origin is recorded. The admitting diagnosis in the clinical language of 1931 is recorded. The name of the superintendent on duty at the time of her admission is recorded. Her name appears in no published history of the institution. What she would have known across those 23 years is not in any document that survives, but the physical record of the institution itself, The annual reports, the inspection filings, the architectural surveys, makes it possible to reconstruct the outline of what her days contained. She would have known the names of the wards because the wards had names, not numbers, in the Kirkbride tradition. Names that were meant to carry a different weight than a number, names that a patient could say without being reminded at every utterance that she was a unit in a managed population. She would have known the smell of the laundry building, which was documented in maintenance records as the largest single-use structure on the campus, operating 6 days a week, staffed in part by patients who were assigned there under the therapeutic labor protocols that Kirkbride's model prescribed. The smell of institutional laundry, steam, lye soap, damp cotton does not appear in any archive, but the building that produced it is documented. It stood for decades. It is gone. She would have known Dr. Harold Voss, who served as superintendent of the institution from 1944 to 1951, and who, the administrative correspondence confirms, argued on multiple occasions before the State Review Board for Margaret's discharge, on the grounds that her condition had stabilized and that continued institutionalization was not clinically indicated. The board overruled him. The correspondence documenting those arguments is in the archive. The board's reasoning in the surviving records is recorded in language so compressed as to be nearly empty. Continued observation recommended. Voss filed the same argument the following year. The board overruled him again. Margaret remained. She was discharged 3 years after Voss left the institution, under a different superintendent, as part of a broader release of long-term patients that preceded the formal deinstitutionalization policies of the 1960s by nearly a decade. She was 63 years old when she left. She had been inside since she was 40. The garden where patients were permitted outside during summer months is documented in the institution's annual reports as a half-acre enclosure on the south side of the main residential wing, enclosed by a low stone wall, planted with flowering shrubs, and maintained by a combination of paid groundskeeping staff and patient labor. Patients were permitted 1 hour per day in the garden during the months of June, July, and August. The reports describe this as a therapeutic provision. Margaret would have had access to that garden for at most 3 months of each of her 23 years there, a total of roughly 69 hours of outdoor time across more than 2 decades if the provision was consistently honored, which the inspection records suggest it was not always. Her daughter is dead. She died in 2003, having spoken rarely about her mother's institutionalization and having left no written account of what Margaret told her about those years, if she told her anything. The granddaughter, Margaret's daughter's daughter, was interviewed by a regional newspaper in 2007 in connection with a local history project that had nothing to do with the institution. At one point in the interview, she mentioned that her grandmother had spent time in a state hospital. The interviewer did not follow up. The interview was published without that detail. The notation exists only in the reporter's unpublished notes, which were donated to a local historical society and which have not, to any knowledge available in the public record, been read by anyone since. That is the chain of transmission. Margaret Ellison, 23 years inside an institution whose buildings are partially demolished and whose name has been administratively reclassified. Her daughter, who did not speak about it. Her granddaughter, who mentioned it once to a reporter who did not follow up. The unpublished notes, sitting in a box in a local historical society. The chain is not broken, but it is one box away from being so. The archives that remain open are specific and accessible. The New York State Archives, located in Albany, holds admission and discharge ledgers for most state psychiatric institutions through approximately 1960. A researcher with a valid identification and a written request can examine them. No advanced credentials are required. The National Archives holds the partial reconstruction of the 1890 federal census, the fraction that survived the January 1921 fire, and that reconstruction is available through the standard research access procedures the National Archives applies to all its collections. The Pennsylvania State Archives holds the published annual reports of Dr. John Kerwin, superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane from 1854 onward, in their original printed form. Those reports describe in detail that has not been synthesized into any widely available historical account the operation of one of the largest and most deliberately designed psychiatric campuses in 19th century America. None of these require permission beyond the permission that any member of the public already holds, but the archives are not static. Since 2010, physical document loss attributable to consolidation decisions, storage condition failures, and digitization processes that did not preserve the original materials before disposing of them has been documented in at least 3 states. The losses are not catastrophic in aggregate. They are incremental, a box transferred without a complete inventory, a ledger series that ends abruptly 3 years before it should with no notation explaining the gap. A folder whose contents were photographed at low resolution before the originals were removed from the collection and whose current whereabouts the archive's own finding aid lists as unknown. Incremental losses accumulate. The photograph I described at the beginning of this account, the one with the columns, the cupola, the manicured carriageway, the brass plate beside the entrance bearing a superintendent's name and a year, is still in the box where I found it. It is not cataloged. It does not appear in the finding aid for the collection that contains it. Someone placed it in a folder with unrelated materials, perhaps decades ago, and it has remained there since. The building in the photograph does not exist. The superintendent whose name is on the plate has been dead for more than a century. The institution he ran is a name in a ledger, in an archive that most people who live near it do not know exists. The photograph knows none of this. It holds the building exactly as it stood on the day someone pointed a camera at it and recorded the light coming off the stone. The columns, the cupola, the grounds extending in both directions farther than the frame can hold. A building that was built to say something about the people inside it, about what they were worth, about how seriously the century that constructed it took the obligation it had undertaken. Buildings remember what they were built to say. The ones still standing remember it. The ones that are gone remembered it until they couldn't.